Okay, so thank you for coming to our final plenary for the conference. I'd just like to introduce Sandra Hurst to you. Sandra Hurst is an Associate Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Calgary in Canada. Sandy has held several leadership positions in gerontology, including President of the Canadian Gerontological Nursing Association and President of the Canadian Association on Gerontology, who are also celebrating their 50th anniversary this year, so it's a nice link. Sandra has completed a 3-year appointment from the Prime Minister to sit on the National Seniors Council and currently sits on the board of the National Initiative for the Care of the Elderly, the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, and the International Federation on Ageing. In 2012, Sandra received the Jean Mance Award from the Canadian Nurses Association, which is the highest honour that a registered nurse can receive from her peers for her contributions to the care and well-being of older adults. Sandra's passion lies in the stories of the older adults and the learning that we acquire from listening to them. And so she will talk to you today on, as a wee lassie, the benefits of narrational relationships in the lives of older adults. Thank you very much, Sandra.
Thank you, Carol. And I would thank Anthony as well, who is acting as technical backup. Ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, I am biased. I am so biased, I'm telling you up front. I'm sitting here in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Canada, but I actually started my career in York in the UK. So I want to thank the British Society of Gerontology for this opportunity to talk to you and to return to my roots. And I'm just going to share stories throughout this presentation with you because that's where the interest and the passion lies. When I first started working in York, I worked in a Nightingale ward, as we used to call them, 15 beds down one side and 15 beds down the other, all full of older ladies. And each one of those ladies had a story to tell. It may have been about their grandchildren. It may have been about their first job. It may have been about their marriage. It may have been about working in the forces. And one night, as I was going off duty, Dilly and Maud, who had the 2 beds at the end of the ward, opposite each other, were teasing me about newly married bride, couple of weeks, and they wanted to meet my husband. So I thought, okay, my husband came to pick me up, and I marched him proudly down to the end of the ward and said to Dilly and Maud, "This is my husband, Martin." And he was pretty courteous. So we went home, and I was feeling snug. The next morning when I went on to the unit, Dilly was not very happy with me. And she started talking about I'd introduced her to my husband, but she hadn't got her teeth in. And out of that story, I learned from myself how to reflect on meeting Dilly's needs more than mine. But she talked about teeth. Simple little story about not having her teeth in. And I've always wanted to acknowledge Dilly for really reinforcing to me the need for personal hygiene, personal appearances, that sense of well-being. Simple little story. So where do stories come from? How do they excite us? How do they move us to thinking? Why do we want to tell them? So let me show you this slide for a minute.
Long time ago, tribes from all over the world came together for a gathering. They had a good time. A challenge, actually, to see who could come up with the scariest thing. Some of them brewed potions. Some of them jumped in and out of animal skins. Some of them thought up devices, weapons, and traps, until finally there was only one tribe left who hadn't done anything. No one knew where this tribe came from, and all this tribe had was a story. The story this tribe had was a scary tale, full of fear, blood, horror. When the telling was done, the others trembled with fear. "You win," they said, "but what you just voiced, it's chilling. Take it back," they demanded. "Call that story back." But of course, it was too late, For once a story is told, it cannot be called back. Once told, it stays with us forever.
But history has put storytelling into that cadre of the most critical components of our knowledge development of humans. The stories give moral education by talking about exemplary deeds. They help us teach social laws to our children and to our society. They preserve our history. And so those are some of the values that stories, but that cultural connotation, I think perhaps is well reflected. This is called a kachina. It's a Native American storyteller doll, and they're also called Pueblo storytellers. If you ever want to come to Calgary, I have about 30 of them, all different, but they all share certain similarities. The open mouth of the elder telling a story to the children, to preserve that culture, to pass it on. You may see children, as this one image shows, or you may see animals hearing the story. There may be one listener, there may be many, but it's telling the story to preserve the history that comes for us all. So I've structured my comments about the meaning of stories, what have we learned from the narrative, specifically the contribution of narrative inquiry to knowledge, the voices of older adults with dementia, and that's very, very clearly a passion of mine. How do we facilitate storytelling? And talk a little bit about the public narrative and that public narrative, that need for social change, that need to move forward into action is a thread I tried to weave throughout this presentation for you. And as you will know, I will tend to wander off track and try to pull myself back in. So let me start with a picture. Any idea who he is? Just think a little bit about it. I'm modifying the story a little bit. This is an older gentleman I'm looking after right now. Don't know very much about him. He came in with his wife, accompanied by one of his daughters, but on admission to my long-term care facility, I really don't know who he is. But stories that I learned from him, stories of lived experiences, their subjective meaning, that sense of self and identity, are revealed through the stories that we listen to and the stories that we tell. So in this example, I'm working with an older gentleman, but he's had 85 years of storytelling and life behind him, stories coming through personal experience and simply the passing of years. So by encouraging him to be a storyteller, I learn about him. He's married with 2 children. You see a little bit more of him? Now remember, I'm Canadian. That will help you here. He used to teach high school drama. Picture becoming clearer? Now, he lost a brother in a skiing accident, had a brother born on Christmas Day, like father, like son. Now, regretfully, our Prime Minister actually shaved last week, so this picture is not current. But my point was to talk to you a little bit about that sense of understanding through the stories he told me in the day-to-day interactions that we had about who he was and how I take that knowledge back into the care I give him. So hopefully by recognizing older adults, we hear their voices and we respond accordingly. And that relationship I build up with my client is called a narrative relationship, as we know. And that's why I use the picture of Trudeau. But aging itself really is a narrative construction. Rather than beginning with the aging individual, a view that tends to devalue old age and separate it out from all the diverse cultural and social manifestations, let's consider what Kaufman wrote. And about 30 years ago, Kaufman, in completing her PhD, said, and I'm going to quote, "The old Americans I study do not perceive meaning in old age itself. Rather, they perceive meaning in themselves in old age." So in her book, which is called The Aging of Self, Stories and Meaning in Later Life, she made the deliberate decision to identify participants as aging individuals. And she said, no, I'm not going to do it that way when she first approached it. I'm going to look at them as individuals and look at how they have constructed themselves in that later years of their life. She did understand that aging and age itself were problematic, but they were narrative constructions, she said. It didn't actually explain to her how these aging individuals constructed their lives. And as she went on with her study, she talked in great deal about their individuality as aging people was formulated from the various sources of meaning that they used to construct their accounts. So their life experiences made them who they were in their later years, and to use the stories to talk to these adults about those experiences. So I want to illustrate this point and bring in social change. Olive Brighton is now, she was born in 1936 in a little tiny province called Prince Edward Island. It's got about, 160,000 people in it. It's really quite tiny, large rural areas of Canada. Now, Olive was born in, like I said, 1936 in the rural part of Prince Edward Island to an unwed mother. And she once said, "A sweet little old lady I am not." She was raised by her single mom with her grandparents in an intergenerational household then. Her great-grandparents lived down the road. And she said there was never any gender assigned task. You just did the work that needed to be done. But she also said because this world was so positive and filled with positive role models, that she really understood that aging could be done positively. And you didn't complain about aging. It was part of who you were. But she went on then, and in her late 70s, she started thinking again about the advocacy role that she really has done all her life, and I consider her a friend. But she said more than half the women and even half the population in this province are actually not having their services met. She said, how does the government know what services older women need unless the research is done to identify it? Because governments won't change without research and coming through. So she said at the age of 76, she went back to university to complete her PhD. And the documentary Never Too Old is actually a film on her personal story of the later year of her PhD program. And she said at one point, although I believe I'm writing about what women told me, maybe unconsciously I'm still trying to say, look at what these women are doing. They're not a burden on society. They're actually who they are. Why can't you see that? And interesting enough, as an aside comment, Olive is working on a national strategy to look at elder abuse across this country. But the reason I like this Olive story and like her film is that this film actually won the 2020 Resiliency and Aging Film Award, which is a critical component of the Third Action Film Festival. This Third Action Film Festival tells the stories of resiliency and activism in aging in a new social light. They're trying to address the stereotyping and move us beyond that to look at advocacy. Older adults, think a second about the last movie or the film you saw. What story did it tell? One of the words I like to use is symbolic annihilation. And it's a term used to describe the absence of representation of a group and its impact within society. So when you look at mass media, the films, TV, interview, it means if we don't see ourselves represented, we don't matter. We're not important. This is heightened by the fact that what media is out there is often fraught with medicalization of aging. For example, films about dementia and the dementia journey, which, while important, are not the full story of aging, or they're talking about narrative stereotyping. So that leaves audiences to believe that aging is simply nothing but decline and frailty. But Olive's story in this film actually contradicts that. It is intended to stimulate audiences to action. So when you watch the film and you leave that audience and move beyond it, you can say, that film showed us that life is good. That film showed us that Olive at her age now is actually moving ahead. And it's really an exceptionally good film. But it's how you advocate for change. And I'm biased because I really think the film is exceptional in its storytelling. But what happens in the film with Olive and with others is what we call narrative identity. Through the series of stories, there is an identity that Olive has created. And that all of us through the stories... narrative identity. Think a little bit about hang on, that shouldn't be there. Such a richness to our Let's take that one off. That's probably the only one that you still see the picture of me in there. This isn't my best picture. But that sense of narrative identity, through the stories we tell, we create that narrative identity. White wrote that storytelling helps shape people's lives because it allows them to really reflect on who they are individually. Lapointe said that identities are created simply by the stories that we tell to each other and to ourselves. But it wasn't until McAdams actually used the word narrative identity that we put a theory behind it. And the theory of narrative identity simply suggests that we require an identity to know who we are, that we make sense of ourselves and our lives through the stories that we tell, or sometimes cannot tell, that we come to know ourselves in this way as individuals. So the self is conceptualized not as a distinct fixed entity of a social system, but rather as an adaptive, ongoing, emerging process. A narrative identity for all of us actually probably starts in our late adolescence, early adulthood, but it's a process that continues on throughout all of our lives. It's a selective reconstruction of our own autobiographies. It helps anticipate where we're going to be in the future as well. So as I said, people begin their narrative identity in their early adolescence, but it continues on throughout the life story. So think a little bit about the narrative identity that you've created for yourself. And I'm just trying to get the next slide for you, which should be, okay, Andy, this isn't letting me get to the next slide, and it should. Any reason why?
Try the arrows.
Let's try this. Let's
where
try
it says,
this.
Where it says
Anthony, you're brilliant. Why these are still on there, I do not know, but I took them all off. Stop it. Okay, you recognize that picture from the Titanic? Recognize the history and the story that she told? So stories are universal. When you look at all the literature, there are 4 key points that come out for the power of stories. Stories are universal. They cross boundaries of language, culture, and age. They mirror human thought. I'm going to come back to this one in a minute. So all evidence from neurology and psychology lead to the conclusion that we actually think in narrative structures. Stories define who we are. What was the story you told over your tea break or over your morning breakfast this morning? And stories help build a sense of community and identity. This is an interesting research study. For me, it's interesting. It comes out of work that Hassan did out of Princeton University. Hassan asked an individual to tell a story. Just tell it naturally like you would to a friend. Don't worry about rehearsing, just simply tell the story. And then he actually recorded that, and he asked the listener to hear that story back on the recording. And what Uri Hassan found was that the storyteller's brain activity actually began to sync with the listener on both in the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex of the brain, that there became a synchronicity. And then when Hassan introduced other listeners into the listening of the story, the brains of the listeners as well began to sync together. So it shows that there's a synergy between the listener and the teller of that stories. So let me move on a second though. So what do we learn from the narrative and the telling of those stories? It's an interesting perspective that we've already talked a little bit about how we shape our lives by stories, that we lead stories' lives. So again, as I mentioned, think about the story you told earlier. So stories are a portal through which the individual enters the world and by which the listener interprets that experience of the world with them, and how both the listener and the teller accept meaning into that. So narrative inquiry really is the study of experience of the story. Experience is the story. It's the phenomena under study. And that's why I find it so fascinating, listen to the stories. What do we learn from them? What do we gain from them? So to use narrative inquiry as a methodology is to adopt a specific narrative view of experiences under study. And I included in the slide a list of some of the current definitions, and I'll talk about my bias in a minute. But I like Chase's near the bottom. Life experiences as narrated by those who live them. Stories are the raw data. Now, my bias comes through here. Michael Conley and Jean Clendenin actually pioneered narrative inquiries for curriculum studies in higher education. And I've actually worked with Jean Clendenin, and very, very early in my own doctoral work, I actually took courses with her. And this is what pulled my interest in, because although she spoke about teaching and education, it holds very, very similar truths for nurses, healthcare workers, social workers. And they define narrative inquiry that narrative researchers look for ways to understand and then present real life experiences through the stories of the research participants. So that's my bias coming through. They built on Dewey's notion that experiences are continuous and interactive, and if we intentionally reflect upon them, they're educational, both for the teller and for the listener. So narrative inquiry is a way of understanding experience. It's a collaboration between a researcher and participant over time, in a place, or in a series of places within a social milieu. And as a researcher, when I enter this matrix, I'm entering into the same spirit that I am in the midst of living and telling and retelling and reliving the stories of the experiences that make up people's lives, both individually and socially. And I want to actually turn to another slide for you here. And this is one that I find absolutely fascinating in my exploration of stories with older adults, because it really is called narrational inquiry. It's called a three-dimensional space continuum. And I'm going to illustrate this in a minute with another story. But it really tells, when we go into that exploration of story with a participant, we're looking at the interactional component, we're looking at the continuity component, and we're looking at the situational place component. So when you look at these, that personal social quality informs our construction of knowledge and knowledge identity. But we know that any experience happens in a place, in a situation. And we know that when you look at a situation or place, we have to also consider that perspective. So when we study experiences, I'm just looking at something that I can actually send you the video clip. Someone's asking about it, so sorry for that deviation. So when we look at the interaction with continuity in a situation or place, when studying experiences, we have to look in four directions. We have to look inward into the internal experience of the participant and ourselves as the researcher, and I'll come back to that later. We have to look outward as well to the situation, the context, the time, and we have to look both forward and backwards in our conversations. And I want to give you an example here, and I have permission to use these stories. The individual on the right, and these names, of course, are made up, is Ken. I first met Ken when he was just admitted to a private unit of a long-term care facility. He was in his mid-80s, and he'd always been an active individual. He was a former police officer and educator. And Ken had dementia. The exact cause of it was unknown. He certainly had memory problems. He certainly was able to use the walker and walk in and out of other residents' rooms, picking up any pair of glasses he saw. But one day on the unit, his wife Linda came in. And this is the picture Linda asked me to show because she was happy then. She's about 20 years younger than Ken was. Apparently, Ken had a heart attack in his early marriage. But the first conversation I had with Linda was Linda telling me about that heart attack Ken had had and how it had changed her life, that she had had to move down to Arizona in the southern states for 6 months each year because the doctor had told her that's the only way Ken was going to live. So they purchased a place down there. And then the next time she came in, I said to her, not going to Arizona this year? And this was in January. She said, well, yes, I am. So she actually did go down to Arizona. When she came back and I saw her again, she said Arizona was the place I was born to live. But she also spent 20 minutes telling myself and the staff off about the fact her husband wasn't getting what she called quality care, that he was getting dehydrated, he was getting decubitus ulcers. She was extremely critical of the staff. She also talked on one of the other visits about the last time she'd taken her husband to Arizona, and she thought one last fling, as she put it. And the more and more I talked with Linda over these visits, the more and more I learned about her story. And although Ken was my initial client, he was actually a lot easier to provide care for than Linda was. Linda was the one who was coming out with all these stories. She actually did have her sister in Calgary here, and she had a stepdaughter as well. Um, when Linda came back up to Calgary after her last trip to Arizona, during that time, she was 6 months in Calgary, Ken was transferred from the long-term care into acute care 5 times. Linda never went in. She called her sister and said, "You go in, I can't do it." So it's really an interesting, within Linda's story, as I interviewed her and our research question was, tell me about life in a nursing home. And we were looking at the story she was telling us, both Ken, who primarily was talked about food a lot, and Linda. But Linda's story was so enriching, so encompassing. It was a story of such deep loss, of such despair, of such a feeling that she couldn't achieve what she was meant to achieve. And she said to me recently, "I could have been great." And I thought, wow, but the loss that she was feeling, all the stories about going to Arizona for the last time, and not being able to continue to work as a lawyer, not being able to play tennis, the loss was building up. And so really that story for her was a life journey often of despair. But within Linda's story, there were so many numerous small stories, each contributing to the whole. And I often call those the inner stories. And if I ignore those inner stories or don't listen to them, or I don't often get the richness of Linda's full story. Now, Linda right now, does have a history, regrettably, of, shall we say, alcohol use. And I still see her regularly, even though Ken died recently, not due to COVID, but during COVID. And I still follow up with Linda. She emails me. But that inner story within a story to me is critical. But it's also a strategy that's often used by others. So it's something we need to pay attention to. And I use the simple example. If you ever read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I am not a horror reader, but in that story, Mary Shelley used the same technique. Robert Walton, for example, writes letters to his sister, and in those letters, he describes the creation of a creature as told to him by Victor Frankenstein. And there's another story featuring the creature itself as told or recounted by Frankenstein. And then there's even another further story of the creature living with a family. So each of those individual stories collectively works. But I'm going back to my conversations with Linda. When I engaged with her as a researcher, I became a co-participant. I constructed that story of grief out of the stories that she told me. And it's not an unusual story that Linda told, but how much is my voice to be heard and how much is Linda's voice to be heard? And that's always a balancing act for all of us as researchers. I'm not sure, but for many of us, when we first began our research journeys, I was always told, don't use we, don't use I, not scholarly, not academic. And yet in the voice of narrative inquiry, that voice of the I and the we becomes exceptionally important. How do I actually construct Linda's story and begin to understand what she's telling me so that when I retell it back to her for transparency and genuineness, she can recognize her story in that? Can she? Is it transferable then to other persons? And yes, it should be, because in the transfer of that story to others, society, that's where that social action comes in. That's where I use Linda's story of grief with the voices of others to influence social policy and social change. And so it's really critical for me to understand the significance of that narrative for others and for society. So I mentioned that voice of the narrative coming through. So how do I maintain that balance of the voice? How do I begin to think, what is Linda telling me and what am I telling me? And I'm going to quote Deborah Bitzman here, Voice is meaning that resides in the individual and enables the individual to participate in a community. The struggle for voice begins when a person attempts to communicate meaning to someone else. Finding the words, speaking for oneself, and feeling heard by others is all part of the process. And I raise that point specifically because I often hear it from families in our conversations and our research that they don't feel heard, that they don't feel listened to. And when it comes to dementia client later, that voice of family actually enriches the story. For me, this kind of knowing is actually narrative knowing. We all know empirical knowledge, benchmark sciences, the use of statistics, but when we talk about narrative knowing, it's extremely critical knowing. And we know that's actually, I promised Faithy to send the quote. We know that narrative knowing draws its theories from a lot of different ways of analysis and thinking, but it means for me, and this is my bias coming through, it's co-construction. It's that working with the participant. Now I'm looking at my time, but I want to tell you one story. One absolutely essential strategy that I use is I take nail polish in, and I take two colors of nail polish. I take a very dull pink and I take a very brilliant green or blue in. And I sit down with my older ladies and I hold out the two nail polishes. No one has ever picked the green or the blues or that. They pick the pink. But it's a beautiful way to begin to construct that knowledge with them. We know that stories are actually more of a way of learning, a more a way of knowing than any analytical, any logic. They can make more of an impact on the individual. Feminism was simply talking. I am not a feminist by any stretch, but I do believe in the power relationship is a critical element and influences the research relationship, that narrative inquiry. So when I take my nail polish in, I'm actually beginning to shift the power and the decision making back to my older residents. And examining that power relationship and removing it helps really open up the voices for me. Boy, I only feel I'm touching the surface. I talked about co-construction because it's absolutely critical that when I listen, I move beyond. I retell the story, but I retell the stories collectively that the individual can recognize and understand as part of their own story. And I find that retelling of the story is absolutely so fascinating. I'm just going to briefly mention one limitation here that's for me is really important. They'll probably mention too, the institutional context. And I've specifically cited this study because it made an extreme impact on me when I actually read it. What Rob and Greenhead did was, in a study of participants' experiences, participants told very positive stories, appreciating the professional translator, the accuracy of the words they felt were coming through, just about very positive in their praise. But when the researchers actually used volunteers from a healthcare agency to do the translation, the participants had a different story. They spoke about discomfort with the official interpreting, and that for me was a really significant impact about how does that institution influence the recordings. And I know too, I've had clients who've sometimes simply burst into tears on me. And so the story at that point may stop permanently or I may stop for the while. But sometimes, even if I go back to Linda, Linda has never been really fully able, I think, to understand her own grief and her own loss because she's always put it on somebody else as the cause of it. She's never said, this is my responsibility and my actions. So there are limitations to doing this sort of research, as there are to any. And I'm moving a little bit quickly because I really want to get on to dementia. But for me, that ethical issue is something all of us as researchers do. And I'm using the value of metaphors. We often find in our research, in our conversations, that the full voice of the storyteller comes through the metaphors they use. And I use, for example, the very opening, the sense of when I was a wee lassie. That story was told to me by a Scottish lady, and she actually used to have to feed the chickens on the farm. And for her, that example of the chickens and how they peck and they peck and they peck was actually illustrating her life story. Because as we started talking more and more, she talked about actually hating the farm issues, wanting to get away from it, wanting to have a life in the city. And really some really interesting comments, and I hope you are too, probably distracting me, but I find them really fascinating. I have to go to dementia. For me, it's such a core of who I am and what I do. This is a picture of David and his granddaughter, Brittany. Notice on David's lap that little toy poodle? For me, the older adults I work with who have dementia have such a wealth of experience and such a wealth of knowledge. And I go keep thinking, how do I take that back into the care that I give? How do I make them have more quality of life? And for this young man, David, his life story, he was British actually. When I talked to him, I never got a response from him very much. I knew how to provide physical care. His granddaughter would come in fairly regularly, about once or twice a week, and I don't think he knew her name. I honestly don't think he knew her name. She would take him into the lounge and they would sit there, and she would put that toy poodle on his lap, and David's face lit up. It absolutely lit up. But you took the dog away, and I forget the dog's name, but when David's eyes would follow that dog around the room, because Brittany would share it. It's a challenge, but David would his eyes were just absolutely fascinating. But I will talk a little bit because David, I thought initially I was losing his story. I was losing that sense of who he was. And so I thank very much both the dog and Brittany for giving me insight into David's story. It's called Curating Identity. Curating identity is listening to the voices of others through his, I know he had a daughter. He may have had a son, I'm not sure. I know his wife was dead. I know he had some medical history, but all those elements added together did help me enrich David's story. But I never heard fully from David's story, so I had to use curating. Now, I do think there's been some really interesting work more recently done, particularly in ethnography, to begin to shape up David's voice. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those studies because I think they're so relevant. And we come through that through the use of props. Now, the first one here is simply the use of clothes and clothing. And what we found, the prompts can be an extremely facilitative way to begin to hear the story of that person. Now, there was one study actually done by Arslan, and it's a couple of years old, about 10 years old now. And he found when you showed older adults pictures, he showed two groups of older adults, one who had cognitive impairment, one who didn't. When he showed them both groups of personal pictures, personal family mementos, those who did not have cognitive impairment told more fewer texts, they more initiated conversation. But when he showed general photographs of a New Year's Eve celebration or a general birthday celebration, older adults with dementia were actually as responsive in the number of texts they cited and the number of times they initiated conversations. So the work illustrates that perhaps specific memory props are used simply for that, for memory triggers, but the generic props can be used to facilitate storytelling and social remembering. The same issue with clothes. There was a really interesting study looking at clothes, and it was done at about 3 or 4 years ago. And the research actually look at the clothes you're wearing now. Look at the clothes you wore yesterday. They give us a sense of identity, a sense of purpose. What do you wear when you're not online? What do you wear when we can't see you? And what they found was there were 3 categories of clothing. There were kept clothes, there were discarded clothes, and then there were absent clothes. The kept clothes were the ones that we put away, that we were connected to understanding our past, those sorts of who we were. Those kept clothes were retaining our identity and our connections. And then they had the absent clothes that evoke sensory imaging, sensory memories, and all of them actually trigger some stories. I mentioned a little bit there about simply drama and the link through drama therapy. There's some really interesting work done with drama therapy. And what they've showed is that you use drama therapy, you use a social reminiscing group, and the drama therapy can actually increase quality of life for older adults who have dementia. So I found that's an interesting one to use. I always go on. I wanted to mention that this is the current study we're working on. And it started out by my own reflections and some of the stories I was hearing, and kept thinking, how do I hear the voice of the person who has dementia? So we're working with a couple of students and a colleague, and what we did was initial search of who has actually written their personal story of dementia. And we found to date 36 books of individuals who have written their personal story, sometimes co-authored, but never just written by a family member. There's lots of those. So we found these 30 plus books written by an individual who has dementia. Sometimes it's Lewy body, sometimes it is identified as Alzheimer's. And each of those begins to tell the personal story. And they're I have now up to about 18 we have read. My colleague is reading the same 18. I have a stack on my desk here still to finish reading. But what is absolutely fascinating in these, they're each written in a different style. Some of them are written very much from the researcher perspective. They're written as field notes and then a reflection on the field notes. Some are written as a diary. Some are written as advice. There's more anger evident, there's more frustration evident, but all of them speak of a journey, and they speak of the role of healthcare professionals in that journey. And what's extremely stressful for me is sometimes that healthcare interaction was not positive. They weren't feeling heard. But in others, they felt heard and they valued that healthcare professional sitting down and saying, let's talking about them. They value the social spheres and maintaining those relationships. So for me, that's a really fascinating way to continue that journey. And I want to talk a little bit about this public narrative, because that's where social change comes in. I'm sure you can all recognize an early Barack Obama. I think a little bit. When he stood at that Democratic convention in 2004, he said, I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story. And we can all begin to come through with that. But he began to use that voice in what we're calling the social narrative. And that social narrative, Marshall Gansey was a former United Farm worker, and he's now a Harvard professor. And he actually developed a template that was used by the Obama campaign to begin to move the story, that private voice, into the public narrative. And that's how we have to make a change. That's how Olive began to make the change with her research. That story of self is that personal story. Why you were called to where you are now. Why was I called to action, older adults? Well, to be blunt, initially I was called because that was the closest hospital where I could find a job as a nurse. I was called to gerontology and nursing older adults once I was there, by the passion, by the love, by the simply wanting to work with older adults. So why were you called there? What story gives your experience to make a change? So maybe that cause is local schools, maybe it's education. For us today, it's older adults and the care that we give. So that's our own story. But the story of us is the story of this society moving forward collectively to make action, to make purpose. So let me give you an example. The International Federation on Aging has a specific vaccination campaign and they started it before we went into COVID, looking at the need for vaccinations in older adults. They have done a superb job with the World Health Organization, the United Nations, for example, to move that need for vaccinations for older adults into the public agenda. The Canadian Network for Elder Abuse, all of us on the board are committed to reducing and alleviating and preventing elder abuse. Our collective voices came together in that sense of self. What are our shared purposes, our shared goals? How do we move to action? And that, how do we develop the public narrative? What are we doing now? And I haven't shared with you because it just came through, but the Canadian Network, we've actually now have a public video on our work to develop a national strategy. We've gone from individual self to collective self to stories of now, to stories of action. So how do we share that? How do we move that forward? And I'm giving you one more specific example that I really like. It's called The Theater of the Oppressed, and it was actually done by work, and a Brazilian colleague introduced me to it, by a Brazilian playwright called Augusto Bolo. And it's been throughout the world now, and there's one in New York. But it talks about actually putting on stage vulnerable population groups and speaking to their stories. So that the one out of the New York was recently done on Black Lives Matter movement, but they're looking at homelessness, they're looking at diversity, they're looking at older adults. And it's a way again of introducing social change, of bringing audiences so that when you leave that room, you're thinking, oh, I never thought of that before. So I've got two last slides. I love this quote. Everything is held together with stories. That is all that's holding us together, stories and compassion. I hope my passion for the care that I do comes through. I hope my passion for listening comes through. And I think, Cal, it's my turn to turn it back to you. We've touched the surface, folks and colleagues, but I hope you just begin to have a little bit of time to reflect upon your own stories and those that we hear. Now, Carol, I know we have one recognition. We have to thank our sponsor. They're critical to this conference.
Thanks. And Anthony, could you just put that slide up, and then we'll go on to see if there's a few questions for Sandy. That was amazing, Sandy. Thank you so much. And you can see all the little cartoon hands appearing to.
Well, you skim the surface, ladies and colleagues. But I really want to thank our funders, because they've been amazing to put this conference on. And Carol, you and Anthony and your colleagues, I know how much work this goes. So I think all of us want to thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. So I think there's a few questions before you disappear.
Can we give my email address? Did I include that?
Yeah, if you'd like me to put that in the chat, do you want to just?
Absolutely. Now, please, I will tell you again, an out of office message, but please email me. I'm responding pretty fast right now, but any questions, ongoing conversations, any stories, fantastic. So thank you for doing that, Carol.
I'll just dig that out while you're talking. Sandy, I wonder, while I'm just doing that, if people would like to unmute themselves so that they're ready to speak, if you'd like to ask a question. So if you raise your hand, but I'll just start with Kathleen's question from the chat. So Kathleen says, you've isolated one part of Linda's lament, as in she hasn't been the person she ought to have been. And it brings to mind the lament of Terry on the waterfront. I could have been a contender. And then she asks, how common is this in narrative storytelling?
I think it depends. For me, it depends on the question I'm asking. I went into long-term care with the last one to look at that experiences of long-term care and the families. Linda, I think, is a very strong case there. I think it's common. Is it dominant? No. I think what's for me is more dominant in the stories I'm hearing right now is that sense of love and that sense of compassion and that sense of wanting good quality care. Linda's grief, I think, is a reflection of Linda. And I can't decide. Maybe Erickson wrote about integrity versus despair. And I'm never sure I actually believed that until I met Linda. I think hers is so extreme and such a sense. One of the other things I picked up in my conversations with Linda and some of the others is people make choices. And Linda made choices, but she blames other people for her choices. So I'm not sure if answering the question. I think you see it. I certainly think I hear it, but it depends upon the stories I'm asking. Because when you look at those books that we're currently reading for the personal narratives, there is some grief, for a loss of what some of the things they're doing. But there's also a sense of joy in some of the new connections they made, that sense of friendship with some of those friends. And those friends can be caring people. And that sense of advocacy, the number of individuals been reading, now, maybe because most of them are early onset, they've had some history there, but they're going out to speak up for advocacy. They're going to conferences. They're going to do webinars. They're going to podcasts. It's I was going to use the word ruddy brilliant. Am I allowed to say that? But it's absolutely fantastic. And we're taking those stories and we're going to be using this at a conference presentation for IFA in November. And we'll also be going to doing it for the Dementia Connection. So I don't think I'm actually answering your question. We hear it, but I think I hear far more of comfort, support, and hope. Linda's never got through that initial stage of grief, in my view.
Brilliant. I mean, that kind of links into some of the sort of life review work, maybe, where people are telling stories but reviewing them at the same time. Hang on. Claire Poppy's asked a question saying, how easy do you find it is for people to be reflexive when they're telling you their stories?
It totally depends on the individual. On my older ladies, that nail polish trick works almost every single time. Now, I don't use it on the men, and the staff laugh their heads off at me, but it gets the conversation going. It's not, I mean, I have to build trust. I have to build a relationship here. I have to build a sense of understanding. So sometimes I wear a uniform, sometimes I won't, depending on the person's story and journey. But I find, because I'm on the unit so often, even the simple saying of a load periodically, even the saying you walk into the dining room or wheeling into the dining room, gives me that relationship building with them. So when I go into, hopefully they'll let me enter in as a research participant. It's easier. Or the family member, if they see me on the unit 3 or 4 times, they're often more acceptable to me coming in, but it's a choice they make. I can tell quite clearly when an older adult, even with dementia, doesn't want me to talk. I can pretty well tell through their body language, through their expressions, that they don't want to talk.
Yeah.
Sometimes the other clue I use often is music. As long as I know what music history that is, it's music will often trigger some response. Not always a full story, but some stories. It's personal, it's trusting, it's relationships. That's the best part of my job, is building those relationships. Not always positive ones, but most of them are.
Great. There's another question here from Sally Ann, who asks, how does multiple data sources, how are they looked into during narrative inquiry research?
Always, well, it depends on the individual, but usually if I can talk to a family member, I really like doing that. I tried, if it's either informed consent, that's easier talking. But if the older family member is around the dining room table and helping to feed their husband or their spouse, that conversation is quite easy. Access to records, of course, depending if I'm going as a researcher or the nurse, but it's usually fairly easy to get. It's just building their relationships and the prompts. It's walking into the room and looking at the cards on the counter. It's looking at the stuffed animals they have. It's looking at the doll. It's being cognizant of what are the data sources I can use and pull into that conversation. So there's a question by an effective story. In fact, I didn't see the last word though, Carol. Effective story.
I haven't seen that one. Oh yeah, so Sally Richards has said, thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. Just wondered what you understand by an effective storyteller.
Effective, that's anyone. To be blunt, one older adult I can think of, Red, who could tell me on for an hour and a half. I didn't stop me, he could continue going on. And I call him Red because of his hair. I can think of another one who may say 1 or 2 words. But if I wait over time, that story comes up. Maybe I'm biased here, maybe I'm optimistic, but in every single encounter I have, I think it's the beginning of a narrative. I think it's the beginning of telling me something. Even when the older gentleman slammed the closet door, I think that story's beginning. So some I get more data, I get more information, I can take it back into care, but I'm really, really careful about when am I there as a nursing caregiver, and one of them there as a researcher. And in all of them, the story, it goes back to my practice. It goes back to how do I take that information. Even slamming the door is a story. I've learned from that. I've learned that that I better be careful what I say, and maybe I need to be between the client and the exit, all those usual safety strategies. But
brilliant. So if we just finish there, I'll just read one of the nice comments out that Louise has put in the chat. So refreshing, Sandra. Thank you so much for sharing your passion for journeying with older people in a way that acknowledges and honours their lives and stories, highlighting personhood and your application of what you've learned in your practice. Excellent. So that kind of sums up what I would have said, but thank you so much. And I think having this one as our looking to the future, let's hope that more storytelling gets into research. That'd be great. What I'd like to do now is just, if everybody who is willing to have their picture shared could put their camera on so we can see as many of you as possible. And if we put our microphones on, we could then clap in real life rather than little cartoon claps as well.
Lovely seeing people's faces.
So put your cameras on if you don't mind a photograph being shared.
Oh, lovely faces.